job of a Prime Minister in difficult circumstances when he's been handed a colossal mandate is to keep going.
I actually think the curve is going to invert a lot more because we're going to get inflation next week. We're going to get payrolls later this week. The job market is still strong and inflation is high.
Almost everybody has reduced their expectations of demand for the year. We reduced ours by about 1,200,000 barrels a day. We're at the 2.4, 2.5 million barrel a day level. That's similar to where the EIA and the IEA are, and I expect that we'll be seeing further downward revisions in demand.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition with Francine Lacqua.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and here's what's coming up on today's program. Johnson defiant. The Prime Minister clings to power as the avalanche of resignations continues, including, well, the new Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi telling him he should go. We're live from Downing Street. Even more restrictive, Treasury yields surge after Fed minutes underscore its commitment to fighting inflation, plus path to parity. The euro is deemed unbuyable by some as Europe lurches towards a possible recession. Samsung sales boost sentiment in stocks. Now, first thing is first, let's check in on the markets. Although I have to say we're all pulled in the direction of this drama in Westminster and the UK. I've never seen anything like it. It's resignation after resignation. I think we count about 50. And then the newly appointed Chancellor really writing quite a long letter explaining to the Prime Minister why he needs to go. He himself not resigning, but saying the Prime Minister needs to go. And he was disappointed that he had not listened to him privately. The markets, of course, when it comes to pound, focusing a little bit on that. We've been speaking to a couple of analysts and currency traders against the dollar. It's at 119.40, saying a lot of the political drama is already accounted, of course, in sterling. Certainly the fact the Prime Minister is now on his way out is probably priced in. What is not priced in is this inflation that could get worse and growth also getting worse. European stocks, though, overall getting a lift, gaining some 1.3% on the rally that we saw in Asia. And that's thanks to some of the tech stocks. Watch out for euro dollar. One of the most interesting moves is, of course, parity, and the fact that traders are pretty sanguine about this. It's not really infecting other asset classes. And then the U.S. 10-year yield, 2.9299. We heard yesterday from the Fed that they will deal with inflation at the risk of slowing growth. And then we look for the ECB minutes a little bit later. Now, across Europe, the other big story is, of course, gas. We saw France, for example, nationalizing EDF. This is a huge story. And I wonder whether we'll see some of these other countries, certainly in Germany and Italy, some of the other governments doing the same. And then the other big question is, of course, how do they balance the books if there's less and less gas coming from Russia? Now, desperate and deluded. That is the front page of this morning's Guardian newspaper as Boris Johnson faces an unprecedented revolt within his government. Now, dozens of Conservative MPs have resigned from their roles, demanding he step down. Even Johnson's newly appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nadhim Zahawi, says the Prime Minister must go. But Johnson remains defiant and has signaled that he will continue to fight for his political life.
You're asking about something that is not going to happen. History teaches us that the best way to have a period of stability and government and not to have early elections is to allow people with mandates to get on.
Now, for more, we're joined from Downing Street by Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden. Lizzie, I mean, there's just too many resignations. There's just too much pressure on the Prime Minister. Does he resign or does he get fired?
Well, you would think that the moment for the podium to come out of number 10 would be now. The Chancellor telling Boris Johnson in public that he needs to go. Of course, he told Boris Johnson privately yesterday, but today he's come out with a letter and a tweet about it. The tweet says this is not sustainable. It will only get worse for you, for the party, and most importantly, for the country. You must do the right thing and go now. Crucially, he is not resigning, the Chancellor, but the number 2 of the government is holding the number 1 hostage in number 10, forcing him to resign. And it's not only Zahawi, it's also the Education Secretary, Michelle Donnellan. She has resigned from the job. She's only been in for a matter of days. She was appointed this week. So Johnson looking extremely weak now.
So what happens next? Is you know, I know there's probably a vote of no confidence next week, but with more resignations, how can he actually hold on?
Exactly, because the business of government is paralysed. The government just cannot get the staff to replace the vacancies that keep on coming. It's almost a third of the government that has gone now, and we're having reports of Tory MPs turning down positions, including former Brexit Secretary David Davis. So the legislative agenda just cannot move forward. What could happen, as you say, the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers could change its rules and have another confidence vote. If that doesn't push Johnson to resign, there could be a confidence vote in Parliament, or the wildcard option, Johnson could try to call a general election, but it's thought that the Queen would refuse that because he doesn't have the support of his party. Remember, this is a Prime Minister, not a President.
Lizzie, thanks so much. Lizzie Burden there with the very latest from Downing Street. Now joining us now, Hannah Smith, Vice President for State Street's ETF business. Hannah, thank you for joining us. So much drama out there on the markets. I mean, there's inflation, there's growth. Now there's this political drama. I mean, where do you see some of the value in assets? I mean, currencies are really all over the place.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me on the show, Francine. Great to see you. At the moment, where we're seeing value is really in some of the defensive sectors. So we have seen a flight to defensives given that these recession concerns have really come to the forefront. So we're looking at defensive, but really quality defensive. So healthcare, where we're seeing the strongest free cash flow within the defensive sectors. It's also got strong momentum and it's not looking expensive at the moment. Also dividends. So dividends offer good, very strong quality, and obviously the yield factor as well is really important. And for us within our range at Spiders, we've seen a third of all inflows this year go into dividend products. So that's really where we're seeing value and seeing demand as well from investors.
I'm breaking some news from the Daily Mirror. This doesn't happen every day on Bloomberg, but according to the Daily Mirror and one of the most respected journalists there, number 10 staff have been told that Boris Johnson will resign. Hannah, when you look at all of the political drama, I don't know whether it changes how you look at the UK. I don't know whether it's priced in or whether you actually make a line because the UK has bigger problems, growth, inflation, and of course the interplay of the two.
Absolutely. So there's two different elements. So we've got the UK stock market, and that is really quite insulated from what we're seeing in UK politics. The UK stock market is very defensive, and there's big international companies. They get a lot of their revenue overseas. So we're not necessarily seeing much of this play out within the UK stock market. That investors are liking at the moment, just as they're looking for defensives in this challenge market. But what we're seeing, obviously, on the economy side is there are a lot of challenges there. We're seeing high inflation at the moment. There's the added pressure of Brexit. We've got a very tight labour market as a result of that. We've also got the UK energy price caps, and so we're likely to see inflation go higher than what we're seeing in the US and also Europe as well. So the UK has a lot of challenges, particularly on the economic side, but we're not necessarily seeing that play out in the stock market.
Yeah, I mean, does it happen? I mean, it's really impacting sterling. And again, I don't know how much of it is a political drama or how much, again, is this growth versus inflation concern. What does it mean for the UK economy?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a challenge for the UK economy. Obviously, they are still, in terms of where inflation is likely to be, as I mentioned, it's a lot more challenging than what we're seeing in the US and Europe. But I think the benefit that the UK economy has is that it did start hiking rates first, not as aggressively as the US, but it has been realistic about where it's seeing recession risks.
Sorry, let me just confirm that we have our sources now also saying that Boris Johnson plans to resign as British Prime Minister. Let's quickly also look at pound. The impact on sterling had already been priced in. That's what a lot of senior analysts had been telling us when it comes to pound. Boris Johnson, Bloomberg, of course, sources saying that Boris Johnson is planning to resign as British Prime Minister. Hannah, then we get on to, I mean, I don't know whether it's election or certainly they'll need to find a new Tory party leader. And then the question is it someone that's as pro-Brexit or not pro-Brexit? Does that change actually how you view the economy as investable?
I don't think there will be a huge change just because Brexit, you know, we've already left the European Union. And so Brexit, I don't think there's going to be a question around that. I think the main focus that we would look on is how they're going to fight inflation and the impact.
Taxes,
exactly.
So that's austerity, taxes.
Exactly.
It's like some of these big things. I mean, at the moment, it's unclear who would get it and so who would become the chancellor as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I think a lot of these things, obviously, is breaking news. So it's still to play out as to who will replace him, what will their approach be on the economy. But so far, what we're seeing is that the Bank of England is committed to tightening, and that should, and committed, obviously, to bringing down some of those inflation numbers.
Yeah, so just moments ago, ago, Bloomberg saying that Boris Johnson is now planning to resign as British Prime Minister. Hannah, are we expecting too much from the Bank of England? So we have the governor. They've enjoyed relatively stability for 10 years with this ultra-low monetary policy. Now it feels like they need to fix growth, they need to fix inflation, employment. Are we putting too much burden on the Bank of England?
The Bank of England, it has a lot of challenges and arguably more so than the other developed economies. Brexit is a huge burden on the UK economy just because it has resulted in a very tight labour market, and this is going to be a big challenge when they're trying to tackle inflation that we're seeing. So I think there are likely to be a lot of challenges within the UK market. As I mentioned, I think the Bank of England is committed, however, and it's been quite firm in its stance on rising rates, and it's done so quicker than some of the other larger economies. But it's definitely one to watch, and more is to see, where to see more play out.
Hannah, thanks so much. Hannah Smith, their Vice President for State Street's ETF business. Just minutes ago, Boris Johnson planning to resign as British Prime Minister. This is according to Bloomberg sources. We are extremely well sourced, especially in the Westminster team. So we know that this is true, but we don't know whether or when this happens, whether this is a matter of time, a matter of hours or days. Coming up, we'll have plenty more, of course, on UK politics. The drama of the last 48 hours with the Chancellor, Mr. Zahawi, saying Boris Johnson must go. And then minutes ago, Boris Johnson, according to Bloomberg, planning to resign as British Prime Minister. This is Bloomberg. It was 4 minutes ago that we saw that headline crossing the Bloomberg terminal, Boris Johnson will resign. This is according to an official. Before that, it was according to Bloomberg sources. Now, what's happening, according to the people on the ground, also we have a fantastic live blog following really blow by blow what's happening in the drama at the moment. That is the UK politics, saying that the usual number 10 meeting resulted in Johnson's core team telling him he had to go. And then according to, of course, a brilliant reporter at the Mirror saying that not only is he resigning, but actually his letter has been prepared. The pound just hitting a session high as a headline crossed the Bloomberg terminal. Boris Johnson planning to resign as British Prime Minister. Now, for more, we're joined from Downing Street by our very own Lizzie Burden. Lizzie, I mean, everything seems to be going much quicker than expected. Does he resign in the next couple of hours?
Yes, well, the cars are moving. We're expecting the podium. You're hearing reports from Downing Street sources that the Prime Minister is preparing to call it a day at Downing Street. It seems that the letter from the Chancellor, newly appointed Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi, was enough to push him to his limit. The resignations had mounted. It was more than almost a third of the government had quit their jobs because of Johnson's integrity over the Chris Pincher affairs handling, the cost of living crisis, the Partygate scandal. It had all been building and government was paralysed. So Johnson, it seems, can do it no longer. What would be the next options? Well, he could, in his speech, say that he's going to set out a timeline for the leadership elections in the same way that his predecessor Theresa May did. Or he could leave immediately and hand over to a caretaker Prime Minister. We expect it would be Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister, who has remained loyal. But for now, finally, it appears that it's curtains for Boris Johnson.
Yeah, we're just getting some breaking news, Lizzie, and it's quite difficult to, of course, verify everything. But this is according to the PA agency, saying a new Tory leader is set to be in place by October at the party conference. So I don't know whether we could see an election very quickly or whether they need to wait for the summer recess. Talk us through the process there.
Well, it's an internal process that the Conservatives will choose their own next leader. And remember, in the past, it has been extremely heated. Remember, Boris Johnson sacked Michael Gove yesterday. It was a surprise, but part of that has been seen as revenge for when Gove sabotaged. It was seen Boris Johnson's own leadership ambitions back in 2016. There are lots of runners and riders in the field. One of them, Nadhim Zahawi, the Chancellor. But the question question is, has he tarnished his own reputation now by being the one that has potentially pushed Boris Johnson to the edge? There's also the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak. He was seen as the golden boy for a long time, but then his own reputation was tarnished by the scandal over his wife's tax affairs, his handle of the cost of living crisis. He too has quit. He's on the backbenches. He could potentially organise a leadership bid. There's the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss. She's kept very quiet in recent days. Perhaps she will be the one. But this is where the attention turns to next. Who will be the next leader?
Yeah, who will be the next leader, Chancellor? Lizzie, thanks so much for some great reporting there on the ground in front of number 10. And keep us posted if you see a podium or any movement. We know Larry the Cat tweeted he's not going anywhere. Lizzie Burden at number 10. Still with us, Hannah Smith, Vice President for State Street's ETF business. Hannah, when you look at ETFs in the UK, and maybe let's stay in the UK just because it's such an extraordinary story. Now we understand, of course, that the new Tory leader is set to be in place by October at that party conference. I mean, what do the markets want? Do they need a leader and at least some clarity now? I mean, this is probably the worst time for a government to go. It's high inflation at a 40-year high. We need to know about tax cuts. We need to understand what the next budget looks like.
Absolutely. I think this is, a really crucial moment, and that was really what Boris Johnson was hinging on, that the UK economy really needed some guidance. And so I think what will be crucial for the market is to understand who is going to be the predecessor and what is going to be their policy and how are they going to tackle this high inflation, the cost of living crisis, and the other issues existing in the UK economy.
Do you see the economy changing, given what, again, I don't know whether this is a country that will need to do much more fiscally, and that's the only way to support growth?
Yeah, I think that it definitely needs to do more fiscally. Obviously, at the moment, we've seen the 25 basis point rate hike. We expect to see more, and I think that they're really, given inflation is set to peak after summer and probably around 10-11%, that's going to be the key focus of the government and also what's needed to be addressed in order for inflation to come down and the UK economy to shore up.
Hannah, let me make sense of what we know so far. So first of all, the Prime Minister, we understand, is planning to resign. This is according to two officials familiar with his thinking. And this, of course, follows unprecedented wave of resignations from his government in the past 2 days. We also understand that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, could stay as caretaker UK leader until October. So it's unclear exactly when the election process is. Hannah, how critical is this for the UK economy? I mean, Boris Johnson staying as caretaker, is that what the markets want? Because it's really a lame duck Prime Minister.
Absolutely. I think that arguably it provides some sort of continuity to the UK, and perhaps the market may see that as a positive sign. I mean, we really have to see how it does take it. My guess is that it might be helpful for there to be, not a vacant, any vacant space left. But I think it's still to be seen how it will play out.
Okay, also watch out for the memes, because in this drama, some of the memes are quite funny. I think Iceland posted something like, if your cabinet is empty, come to Iceland. Hannah, thank you. Hannah Smith there, Vice President for State Street's ETF business. So the latest, Boris Johnson planning to resign as UK Prime Minister. This is according to officials that spoke to Bloomberg. Other media press are also reporting that the letter has already been written, but he would stay on as caretaker until October. We'll have plenty more, of course, on this UK political drama. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. So it was exactly 11 minutes ago that we heard the news. Boris Johnson to make a statement, to the country today. But actually, it was 11 minutes ago that we found out he was resigning. This is according to two sources that told Bloomberg we're expecting either a podium or maybe it's a video message. We're not 100% sure, but we are expecting some kind of statement today. The pound hitting a session high as we got confirmation that the Prime Minister will be resigning following these series of resignations by Conservative MPs. Now, for more on market reactions, let's bring in our very own Danny Berger. Danny, we saw a bit of a liftoff, a tiny move when it comes to pound.
Yeah, we're still under 120 here, so still a lot of weakness coming from sterling, but gaining around 0.5% immediately on that headline. I have to say, Francine, some of the reactions I'm getting, and I was just talking to Sebastian Gailey over at Nordea, for example, that one risk this perhaps removes is that around Northern Ireland. There were some fears of that creating weakness in the pound, so that's maybe where we get some of the gut punch reaction. But Sebastian also highlighting that one of the big risks, of course, is political uncertainty. Who replaces him? What comes next? What do those policies look like? Viraj Patel also throws cold water on the idea that this can continue to strengthen the pound. He calls this move a head fake, writing on Twitter that, no new Tory leader has a magic wand to change the UK macro outlook, the UK current account deficits, and that's what's been driving the pound lower, no matter how much the BOE talks about hiking rates. So this is still a UK currency that is dominated by the macro picture. At the same time, Francine, anytime we do see some strength in the pound, it does tend to benefit those domestic stocks. So if you look at, for example, the smaller cap index, the FTSE 250, you can see there's an immediate jump in here as well, almost up about 1%. Again, how long will this last? Is this just gut punch reaction, Francine? That's the question to be asking right now.
Danny, thank you so much. Our Danny Berger there with the very latest on the FTSE 250. We'll have plenty more, of course, from Downing Street. Boris Johnson set to resign as UK Prime Minister. He should stay as caretaker until October. This is Bloomberg. Boris Johnson plans to resign as British Prime Minister. We're live from Downing Street. Even more restrictive Treasury yields surge after Fed minutes underscore its commitment to fighting inflation. Plus, path to parity. The euro is deemed unbuyable by some as Europe lurches towards a possible recession. Samsung sales boost sentiment in stocks. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson bowing to the inevitable and plans to resign. That's according to two officials familiar with his thinking following an unprecedented wave of resignations from his government over the past 2 days. Well, joining us now is Bloomberg's opinion columnist Marcus Ashworth. The very latest is we also understand that Boris Johnson will stay as caretaker, UK leader, until October, and he will make a statement to the country on Thursday. Marcus, first of all, this changes everything on the economy. What do we know about, first of all, we don't know, of course, who's the next prime minister, but what should the chancellor, the next chancellor, should be thinking about? It's taxes, it's austerity, yes or no, and it's, of course, what they do with debt.
Well, weirdly, I think he needs a bit of extra time to find somewhere to live, but beyond that, I do think that the markets aren't reacting particularly to the political situation because, there's nothing that any new prime minister or chancellor matter that can really do to alter the macro outlook on the UK economy or the world economy, or indeed the strength of the dollar against sterling is, look at the euro going towards a 20-year low. It's got nothing to do really politically with the weakness of sterling. It's all about the strength of the dollar. You look at the FTSE, it's holding up well as an equity market reasonably, and the small caps aren't as well. But it's the gilt market which is the only real barometer of what happens next. And they are handling it pretty well. Big redemptions coming up, shortage of supply. Any new chancellor or prime minister is going to open up the fiscal taps. And we're going to cancel a bunch of tax hikes coming through on corporation, possibly on national insurance, and they will spend more. But there is plenty of flexibility in the gilt market to do it, which is weirdly why sterling markets just aren't reacting, because bigger forces at play. That hideous strength of the US dollar is far more important than really a bit of storm in a teacup politics.
Yeah, Marcus, does it change the relationship with Europe at all going forward, or why are markets, pretty relaxed about it? As you say, storm in a teacup.
That's it's quite a big teacup domestically, but in the global sort of
quite
economic
a big storm.
picture. Yeah, and quite a storm. But the thing is, I think that's the only positive news potentially coming out. If we find someone who's got a more, it's hard not to see how that can't be portrayed by a positive. Even someone like Rishi Sunak, who were probably the most sensible choice markets-wise, either him or probably Sajid Javid, are the only ones who've got a clear economic background that we know about. Not to say others couldn't do, it's just we don't know much about their views and approach. So I think if Rishi Sunak were to come in with a much more conciliatory approach, I think Europe would take it as a big positive that they weren't dealing with Boris Johnson, and I think that could be a long-term fillip. But I don't think it's an obvious one, and that's why I don't think sterling's reacting that much yet, because but that would be the only positive thing short-term for sterling. But there are bigger pressures with that strength of the dollar, I think.
Marcus, thank you so much. As always, Bloomberg Opinions, Marcus Ashworth. He was also on our podcast, actually. It was quite a fun podcast. Of course, it's been completely upended by a lot more resignations, but you should listen to the In the City podcast as well. Now, joining us for more on the UK drama story, Ben Sills from our politics team. Ben, at this point, because Boris Johnson is resigning, this was, of course, confirmed to Bloomberg by 2 officials. Who are the Conservatives that could become the next Prime Minister? Are we actually looking at odds at the moment, or is it still too soon?
Well, I'm sure someone will be drawing up the odds. I think in no particular order. The people that you want to be looking at are Ben Wallace, who's the Defence Secretary. He's a kind of like solid, old-fashioned Tory, like a safe pair of hands type figure who's had a good war. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, traditional Thatcherite, quit as Chancellor this week as part of the wave of resignations that ultimately looks like they brought down Boris Johnson. Or maybe Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, who's like a much more kind of hardline, more Boris Johnson style politician, who's a big favourite of the party faithful.
Ben, and given these are very different personalities, of course, what do you think will be the most pressing issues? I know it's the Northern Ireland Protocol, it's NATO, it's support to Ukraine, and then domestically what they do with taxes and other things. What do you think the next Prime Minister will be elected on?
I think, to be honest, I think the Tory party is really tired of the chaos of the Boris Johnson years. And I think that the chaos actually predates Johnson's time as Prime Minister. The Theresa May years were pretty chaotic as well, largely because of the Brexit movement that Johnson was driving. So my bet would be that it would be one of the more conventional, perhaps slightly boring figures. If you remember back in the 90s, it was John Major, the famously grey figure who they picked to follow Thatcher. And I suspect the party might be in the mood for something a little bit calmer.
Ben, you've been covering politics and government for over a decade. If you look at Johnson's resignation, and this is a great fact from our T-Live blog, which I have to say your team are doing a great work on, this is basically the 4th leader within 6 years that will have gone. David Cameron resigned in 2016, Theresa May resigned in 2019, and then Johnson will resign in 2022. Are UK politics changing because of that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this dates back to the Brexit referendum, which kind of opened up a new rift in British politics, and it took us to a place where the government is focused on delivering a policy that, in many ways, doesn't make sense in economic terms, and yet the government has to this point been determined, kind of like already committed to claiming that it works, and that just leads us into all sorts of crazy situations like we've seen with Boris Johnson, threatening to start a trade war with the EU, while we're supposed to be maintaining a united front over Ukraine. So I think that there's going to be a fundamental reset here, not necessarily or complete with this next Tory government, but I think we've reached the end of the kind of the crazy first phase of the post-Brexit vote.
Ben, thank you so much for joining us. Ben Sills there from our politics team. Now, joining us now is Jill Rutter, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government. Jill, how problematic, first of all, good morning. How problematic is it for the UK economy not having a functioning government? And what does that mean for the Bank of England? It seems it's just giving more pressure on Governor Andrew Bailey.
Well, it's clearly not optimal, but I think the Prime Minister's decision to resign has at least resolved something. For the time being, because I think it was possible that this chaos might have continued into next week, but the Prime Minister does now seem at least to have accepted the inevitable. It's not at all clear what happens, or indeed who is Chancellor. I noticed Marcus talked about Rishi Sunak as Chancellor. Rishi Sunak is not Chancellor at the moment. That's Nadhim Zahawi. What we here is that the Prime Minister will continue as caretaker through till there is a new Conservative leader. But will he really do that? Will people come back and serve in his cabinet? And who is the Chancellor? We'd been promised this big economic reset speech next week. Rishi Sunak said one of the reasons he resigned was that he couldn't agree the content of that speech with the Prime Minister. There were real arguments between the Treasury and Number 10 about where the economy should be going. We assumed that when Nadhim Zahawi was appointed 2 days ago, that Number 10 had found a chancellor who might be a bit more in tune with their thinking, but Nadhim Zahawi this morning said he thought the Prime Minister should go. Do they work on that speech? Do we get that, or do we have to wait for a budget till the autumn? All of this is completely uncertain at the moment.
But so, Jill, what happens to the UK economy? This is, gas prices. There's only 3% of gas from Russia in the UK, but it's gas prices elevated. You have a cost of living crisis, and it's extremely difficult to see how they can get a handle on inflation without killing this economy off at a time when we don't really have a working chancellor.
Well, it was pretty unclear what they could really do about inflation anyway, even if they took measures. I mean, they were talking about measures that might affect the headline rate, possibly a VAT cut, though I think Treasury orthodoxy would say that was extremely unwise when you have an economy where the real problem is too much money chasing too little supply, driving inflation. So it was never really clear what the government would do. We had actually, on the day that all these resignations were triggered, one of the measures kicking into effect that the previous Chancellor Rishi Sunak had introduced to deal with the cost of living crisis, which was a big hike in national insurance contributions thresholds that was sort of benefiting about half the working population. So it may be that we don't expect anything very much for the time being. Of course, the Bank of England is independent, so its course of tackling inflation, maybe more hikes in interest rates to come. They'll be meeting again in a couple of weeks' time.
Jill, does this country need tax cuts, or do tax cuts fuel inflation? And so is that the worst possible pill for it?
It's we've just, as I said, just had sort of a biggish tax cut, but coming on the back of a whole bunch of tax increases to slightly offset the cost of living effects. I'm sure that the Treasury will be saying that this is not the time for unfunded tax cut. We've also got massive public spending pressures on the other side of it. We've got big backlogs post-pandemic in public services. Some real hitches. It's very difficult at the moment in the UK to get a passport quickly. Court services blocked up, big NHS waiting lists, so huge demands there. And the other thing we're seeing is very big pay demands across the public sector and the quasi-public sector.
Jill, Keir Starmer also just tweeting, the Conservatives have overseen 12 years of economic stagnation, declining public services and empty promises. He says we need a fresh start for Britain. If there were to be general elections, who do you think would get in?
At the moment, the way the polls look, it would look relatively good news for Labour, but very complicated because they might very well depend on doing some sort of deal with the Liberal Democrats, who are obviously formal coalition partners with the Conservatives, and potentially also with the Scottish National Party, which continues to dominate politics in Scotland and which has already said that it will regard any upcoming general election as a de facto referendum on independence. So we don't know how that would play out. At the moment, the Conservatives don't look in a good place. I don't think that there's that much prospect, though, of an imminent general election, simply because I think so many Conservatives who would have to decide whether they want a general election would regard this as potentially a recipe to bring in Labour. That was, after all, one of Boris Johnson's reasons for staying, was that otherwise there might be a general election with the threat of a Labour government.
Jill, thank you so much. As always, Jill Rutter, a senior fellow at the Institute for Government. Now, this is what we know so far. It is 9:41 UK time. Boris Johnson has agreed to resign as Prime Minister. He will make a statement today. We have all eyes on Downing Street. We don't know whether this is a virtual statement, whether it's one of a tweet, some of the videos that he pushes out, or whether he'll actually come out of Number 10. Whether we see the Prime Minister or not will be front run by a podium. Our Lizzie Burden is also on the ground, and so she'll give us an update if she sees any any movement there. Boris Johnson, we understand, will stay as caretaker leader until October, the pound hitting a session high. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is bowing to the inevitable and plans to resign. That's a Bloomberg story, agreeing to resign and making a statement today. For more, we're joined by Downing Street by Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden. She's where the action is. Lizzie, it must be extremely exciting. It is quite a small road, actually, for our international viewers. It's a windy and small road. What's it like on the ground? Are you seeing movement? Are we expecting a podium to come out?
Well, Francine, the way it's happened was there was a steady march of staff going in looking like they knew something, and then the cars started to move, and then it was the cameras. I can tell you on the other side of the camera, it is heaving with the world's press to cover this historic moment. Boris Johnson has finally got to the point no one thought he would get to, that he will resign. It didn't come last night, but after that cabinet meeting, the usual cabinet meeting this morning, it seems to have pushed him to the edge. And of course, you had the letter from Nadhim Zahawi, the Chancellor, telling him to resign. Zahawi himself not resigning, but in a sense, the current cabinet holding the Prime Minister hostage and forcing him to the edge. Boris Johnson says that we're hearing that he plans to stay on as caretaker leader until the fall. Notably, it would be a shorter tenure than his predecessor Theresa May if he went right now. But if he carries on as a caretaker, then it will be longer. We'll look forward to his speech. There isn't a sign of a podium yet, but if you remember when Theresa May left, there were tears. Wonder what the tone will be when it's Boris Johnson's turn.
I mean, apparently he gets in a fighting mood when things get tough. Lizzie, almost 1/3 of government has gone following a string of resignations. How will they actually choose a next leader?
Okay, so there are two stages, and it takes several months. The timescales for each of the stages is set out by the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers. The first is about the MPs, the shortlisting stage. So they put themselves forward, and there's likely to be a wide pool of candidates. And the idea is to, over several rounds, whittle those Tory MPs down to 2 and keep out extreme names. The second stage then is it goes to the grassroots members of the Conservative Party. It's a ballot of the party membership to narrow it down to the next leader. But of the candidates who are the runners and riders, they're split. There are those who have remained loyal to the Prime Minister, which in itself could be tarnishing, and then there are those who have already resigned. Rishi Sunak, the ex-Chancellor, Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary who got this ball rolling, to the party membership. To have stayed or to have betrayed the Prime Minister could be what makes their minds up.
Lizzie, thanks so much. Lizzie Burden, they're outside number 10, and of course you can see the door open. Larry the cat, we know, is staying because he is not attached to the Prime Minister. Now let's just get straight to our Bloomberg Economics Executive Editor, Stephanie Flanders. Stephanie, great to speak to you. I mean, we'll talk about economics in a second, but you follow these cycles of politics, especially in the UK. Is the next leader going to be more boring than Prime Minister Johnson?
I think by definition he's going to be more boring. He was clearly it's amazing we're talking about him in the past tense already. Of course, he's not talking about himself in the past tense quite yet. But you know, he has been, throughout his career, let alone his political time in office, one who breaks the rules and overturns what you might expect from a Prime Minister. So, of course, there's a kind of steady as she goes desire. But there is a fundamental, and Lizzie's sort of signalled to it, there is a bit of a problem here because all of these people who now profess themselves to be shocked by the lack of ethics in their Prime Minister and all these things that, of course, we've all seen for almost since he came in office, they are all a little bit tarnished. I mean, the people who stuck around till now, or even till a few months ago, are tarnished by that time in office. So if you're a Tory member, which, as we heard, they're going to be the people who make the final decision. And certainly if you're a voter, you're not necessarily going to be looking for someone who is closely associated with the Boris Johnson government. But then there'll be some who say, no, we have to be true to his election result and that 80-seat majority. So some will say exactly the opposite of what I've said.
But Stephanie, how difficult is it, for example, to lose a government in this really crucial months where inflation is rampant, 40-year high, there's a downturn in the economy, and there needs to be decisions about taxes, austerity, budgets, and debt?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult time, especially when you're going into the sort of summer period where traditionally loads of big things happen and Parliament's not sitting, but you need an effective executive to be working out what's going on. I mean, I think even the sort of short-term task of, OK, these 50 plus 60 people who've left the government, will they come back as caretaker ministers in order to just allow the ship to keep on sailing through the summer? And as you suggest, there is a fundamental debate about whether the government's done enough to support people with the squeeze in living standards coming down the track. The Bank of England, as we know, and we talk about most of the time, has the biggest job here and probably the most important job. But that question about how policies can help households get through this, how much are teachers going to be paid? Who's going to make that decision in the next... there are currently no ministers at all in the education department. And
it's not really playing out on markets. I mean, you saw a little bit of a bounce for sterling, but not huge. But does this put extra pressure on the Bank of England to be more careful in restoring growth? Because you have a vacuum in politics.
I think, I mean, of course, they're focused on inflation, and then the debate has been, are they behind the curve on that? How can they weigh the risk of a recession against the very desperate need to bring down inflation? I think so they've already been fairly cautious on that in terms of interest rate rises. I think that will probably continue, but they would say that none of this really fundamentally affects what they're looking at when they think about that decision. I mean, if we had the Prime Minister stagger on with a new Chancellor who's talking about tax cuts, well, at the margin, that could mean a looser fiscal policy. We can't even say that now because we're not sure who the Chancellor's going to be.
Is there an economist, or do economists have a favourite? I know first of all, the Bloomberg Live blog on the UK drama politics is extraordinary. So the Trade Minister, Penny Mordaunt, viewed in the party as having a strong pro-Brexit credential. So actually, the odds from betting firm Ladbrokes says is one of the favourites to succeed Johnson. Then we have Ben Wallace, Rishi Sunak. This is according to Adair Doyle. Are these pretty much kind of similar candidates in terms of how they deal with the economy?
They're fairly well known, not to the public necessarily, but they're well known to policymakers. They've been on the scene for a while. But there's this interesting game, as Lizzie described. There's this two-stage process. You don't need to necessarily have the majority of the parliamentary party in your favour. You just have to be one of the last two, and then of course things can change. So that's interestingly why people like Penny Mordaunt, Tom Tugendhat is another possibility, Ben Wallace, people who actually had roots with the military, interestingly enough, play very well with conservative grassroots, and that's why they're sort of coming to the fore when they haven't necessarily been in the sort of front line of politics for the last few years. But in terms of economics, very hard to judge. I mean, obviously we know what more or less what Rishi Sunak thinks, although he said he has to compromise a lot with number 10. In terms of economics, I think none of those figures are people who've established themselves in, for a long time in the Treasury or in economic policy jobs. So they would be pretty unknown quantities on that front.
Stephanie, it's really all about fiscal support, right? Is that the one question that you wish we'd know for the next Chancellor?
I think is also, I mean, there's a fundamental thing. When we talk about price-wage and wage-price spirals, these decisions on public sector wages are pretty important. And the decision on the private, I think we've already probably made the decision on whether we're going to fully uprate the state pension, but that in turn has consequences for demand in the economy and whether. But I think that the crucial decisions are going to be on these public sector wage rises and how are they paid for, crucially. If you pay 9% to teachers, are you going to pay for that with reduced education spending or increase fiscal expansion?
Yeah, and it's, mean more people also want an increase. Stephanie, thank you so much. As always, Stephanie Flanders, they're our Bloomberg Economics Executive Editor. Now, this is what the pound is doing. It did get a little bit of a lift, hitting a session high as we got confirmation that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, will be resigning following this unprecedented wave of resignations from his government over the past 2 days. So to look at the market reactions, here's our Danny Berger. Hi, Danny.
Hi, Francine. Yeah, we've almost done a round trip here. We did get a spike up in the pound at at one point pushing close back to 120, but we're almost back at the levels we had before we learned that Boris Johnson would be resigning. Similar story when it comes to domestic stocks as well. Those initially spiked on the report. They started to come back down to earth as well. Now, I just got off the phone with Kit Jukes, who of SocGen, very generous with his time since he's also trying to bash out a note right now on this. But his main takeaway, he said, was that if you remove sort of the wider macro story, which of course is the main driver, we should say, of the pound when it comes to gas, when it comes to inflation, this story of Boris Johnson leaving could be one that is seen as pound positive, perhaps why we got that gut punch reaction. For one, it's been very hawkish fiscal policy. The departure of Rishi Sunak, perhaps a new government in place, could mean more leniency there. At the same time, it might help to remove some uncertainty, some of the unfriendliness towards Europe when it comes to things, especially like the Northern Ireland Protocol. All those things would be positive, Sterling. But there's just so much uncertainty, be it economic or political. And if there's one thing FX markets do not like, it is political uncertainty. Sebastian Galli over at Nordea also pointed out, we just don't know if the next person will be centrist or more extreme. So a lot of uncertainty baked into the picture here. But of course, Francine, we should say that sterling strength, that initial sterling strength, easily undoing itself at the moment.
Daddy, thank you so much. I love our Bloomberg Live blog saying we're about to see a beauty contest. There'll be a wide field of conservative leadership contestants that now will want to look very attractive and to try and persuade their fellow MPs to back them. Trade Minister Penny Mordaunt, viewed maybe as one of the leaders in this contest, having strong pro-Brexit credentials, charisma and good leadership qualities. Ben Wallace, Rishi Sunak, according to Ladbrokes, this is a betting company, second favorites. Now, Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition continues in the next hour. Matt Miller and Kailey Leinz in New York. Our Anna Edwards is here in London. What we know is that Boris Johnson has agreed to resign as Prime Minister. He will make a statement today. All eyes, of course, on number 10. Is there a podium to come out? Is he going to make a live statement? Is it this morning? Is it this evening? We don't know. So stay with Bloomberg for the very latest.
Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition with Anna Edwards, Matt Miller, and Kailey Leinz.
It is 10 a.m. in London, 5 a.m. in New York, and 5 p.m. in Hong Kong. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller with Kailey Leinz here in New York. Anna Edwards is with us from Abingdon Green in London. Our top story today, Boris Johnson will call it quits after an unprecedented wave of resignations from his government. The question is now, can he even stay on as a caretaker PM until October when a new leader is chosen? We have you covered from all angles in London, in Brussels, in Washington, D.C. We've got Lizzie Burden at Downing Street, and we'll start with her there. Lizzie, what have you got?
Well, it started with the staffers walking in, perhaps to give a good internal goodbye. Then came the cars, and then came the cameras. And on the other side of our camera, it is heaving with journalists from the world's press for this historic moment. We're expecting to hear from Boris Johnson by noon London time. There's no podium yet, but it'll be interesting to hear the tone of his speech. Remember his predecessor, Theresa May, it was tearful. Will Boris Johnson, more like him, be cracking jokes? Who knows? But what happened is that the usual number 10 meeting resulted in Johnson's core team telling him that he needed to go. The straw that broke the camel's back seemed to be this letter from his newly appointed Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi telling him to resign. And there was this unprecedented wave of resignations, leaving the government paralysed, unable to function. So Johnson has, we're hearing, is planning to stay on as a caretaker leader, though, as you say, we're also hearing that there's pushback from some MPs even on that point. But it's interesting to point out that Boris Johnson leaving today without being a caretaker would have had a shorter tenure than Theresa May, currently standing at 1,079 days. Theresa May, 1,106 days. If he stays as a caretaker, he could beat his predecessor, but perhaps he'll be hoping that he can make a comeback back like his hero in politics, Winston Churchill.
Lizzie, yes, I'm sure he'll be hoping for those parallels. It's often said that people go slowly at first and then very, very quickly, and this does seem to have been gaining momentum over recent days, of course. Sketch out what happens from here. We, of course, in the very immediate future, look for a podium to appear where you are in Downing Street.
Yes, and it turns now to the question of a leadership election. That would take 2 stages over several months. In the first stage is the shortlisting. MPs put themselves forward to be the next Prime Minister, and it's a wide pool of candidates that want the top job. The idea is to then whittle it down to 2 names to keep out the extreme ones. And the second stage goes to the grassroots of the party. It's a ballot of the party membership. But and then we come down to 1 name, but the names are split into 2 camps. You've got those who have left the government already and perhaps will be seen as traitors, and then there are those who have stayed and are perhaps tarnished by their proximity to Boris Johnson. Those who with strong economic credentials could be important, because let's face it, we're in a cost of living crisis in the UK, but those with military credentials could also be front runners, because there is a war in Ukraine. The next stage will be this leadership election.
All right, Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden reporting from Downing Street. Thank you so much. Let's get to the market reaction now to Boris Johnson's plan to resign. Bloomberg's Danny Berger has been tracking the moves. And Danny, initially it was a stronger pound, though that spike has reversed a bit.
Exactly. It was a gut punch reaction, and now we stop, we rethink what this actually means. It wasn't just pound higher, it was also yields higher and domestic stocks higher as well. Now, I just got off the phone with Kit Jukes asking him, why would this be the reaction? He says, look, if you just boil it down to politics, he wouldn't be selling sterling right now. And folks are not selling sterling, I should say. It's still up by about 0.4%. Essentially, you have some of the uncertainties or the drama taken away of the UK's interaction with the EU. If it's the Northern Ireland Protocol, for example, that has a less contentious debate with the next leadership, that would be sterling positive. The UK, we have to remember, very hawkish fiscal policy right now, too. If that changes, that's also supportive to sterling. Kit Jukes puts it thusly, it is a soap opera, and its conclusion, if it is Johnson leaving, then that is one that is sterling positive. But the other thing to remember is that markets, FX market stocks, they hate uncertainty. We have uncertainty right now. Sebastian Gailey over Nordea said, we don't know whether the next government in power will be centrist, whether it will be something else. So that keeps investors on the sidelines at this moment. Of course, others say, look, in the grand scheme of things, it's all about the macro policy. It's about inflation. It's about gas in Europe. Those are things that are going to continue to put pressure on sterling. So regardless of what happens at 10 Downing Street, it is a negative economic environment for the UK. And just a change at the helm of government won't change that, Anna.
Danny, thanks very much. Bloomberg's Danny Berger with the latest on the market reaction to the politics as it unfolds here in the UK. She mentioned gas prices. That's very topical, of course. Inflation, one of the factors very much on people's minds here in London. Maria Tadeo is covering that from a European perspective. Our European correspondent joins us now from Brussels for Europe's potential response then to this news. First, Maria.
Well, Anna, I have been on my phone now for 20 minutes trying to get a comment, really asking for a comment to European officials on the political drama that we see and play out in the UK, and I've gotten no responses. But clearly they watch and they're interested in everything that happens, potentially the repercussions of a new government. And I think overall, Anna, this really reinforces 2 things. One is that European officials really believe Brexit unleashed forces that have made government in the UK very unstable. Therefore, that makes the bilateral relationship between the EU and the UK also unstable by nature. And then the other thing, and this is where it gets interesting when you go into the future, the forward-looking statements potentially, is that, again, it reinforces the idea, too, that for the EU, it's best to stay calm and not touch or renegotiate anything purely because prime ministers come and go, Brexit secretaries come and go. And then think about this. If 2 weeks ago, Šefčovič had agreed with von der Leyen to open up the entire protocol, who would he negotiate with in the next 2 weeks? So again, it reinforces this idea that for the time being, it's best to stay calm, not touch anything, and then just wait and see what plays out in the UK.
All right, Maria, thanks very much. Maria Tadeo there in Brussels. Anne-Marie Horton is standing by in Washington, D.C. With Anne-Marie, the context here is what we really care about in terms of the relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. It got rocky between Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. Has it changed with the Biden administration, and could it change without Boris Johnson?
Well, there's certainly some hurdles. And you remember at one point during the campaign trail, President Biden had called Boris Johnson a physical and emotional clone of his fierce competitor, Donald Trump. So there were some hurdles in the beginning, but they got a number of issues done, including the nuclear submarine deal, including Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom really supporting this administration as they have these sanctions on Russia and want to continue that pressure on President Putin. But the White House here is dealing with a number of domestic issues, and most notably, as Danny was talking about, the UK economy is dealing with its higher food prices, higher gasoline, inflation. So this administration is just going to look for a partner who could deal with global issues that's going to help their domestic problems, like higher inflation. We haven't gotten any statements yet, but I imagine they're going to be very much so that they'll deal with anyone working in Downing Street, because there is a special relationship, as they have dubbed it themselves, between Washington and London, and they'll want to work and continue that relationship with the British people.
Anne-Marie, thanks very much. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Horton bringing us the latest there from Washington, giving us a response to this breaking news that we are bringing you this morning, that we understand and we are expecting Boris Johnson to resign as the UK Prime Minister. Anne-Marie will be heading to Hay Adams, where she'll be part of a Bloomberg Surveillance special today in Washington. We'll hear from Brian Deese, National Economic Council Director, and Heather Bouchy, member of the Council of Economic Advisors, amongst others. So there's plenty of politics to talk about stateside, of course, as well. Coming up, we discuss the fallout from Boris Johnson's expected resignation. Ben Page joins us, CEO of the polling company Ipsos Mori. That's coming up a little bit later. We'll get a market perspective, of course. Anna Stupnitska joins us, Fidelity International global macroeconomist. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Anna Edwards, live in Westminster with Matt Miller and Kailey Leinz in New York. A busy day for UK politics. Back to our top story. Boris Johnson plans to resign. Joining us now is George Pascoe-Watson, former political editor at The Sun, influential newspaper, of course, here in the UK. George, really interesting to get your insights. Let's start with the here and now. We expect to hear from him soon. We expect him to resign then. What kind of tone, what kind of Boris Johnson do you think we will get here? Because I imagine he's still pretty angry about some of the things that have been happening in the last few days.
Well, he is very angry, and he's still of the opinion that he has in some way been damaged by his own people who've been very self-interested. He takes the view that he was elected by 14 million British people only a couple of years ago, and that they're still behind him, and he's still got a mandate to deliver. And let's be quite clear, Boris Johnson sees himself as a Churchill figure, and he regards his place in history very, very strongly. And I think very clearly you will hear a sense of that. There'll be no sense of remorse and regret. He will try and make clear that he is doing the bidding of his party for the good of the country. But you can be absolutely sure that he is being dragged out of the door here against his will.
He is being dragged out. This is a parallel he likes to draw between himself and Churchill, of course. Where would you expect him to go next, George? Is this? I mean, he's still going to be a member of Parliament, of course. He'll still have a job to do if he chooses to carry on doing that. Not all former prime ministers do.
Yeah, most former prime ministers leave the House of Commons. Theresa May did not, but most of them do. I think the Prime Minister knows that he's got a very lucrative career ahead of him as a commentator, as a writer. He's got a lot of books in him. He likes writing historical novels. And I think there's plenty of that for him in the future. But you might find that actually he moves away from politics on the front line because, you know, to have been the Prime Minister of the country to walk into the job finally and then be hit by the pandemic, being unable to deliver what he had intended to do, to have Brexit mostly done but not fully done, and to not really achieve his ambitions, I think will be very hard for him. Don't forget, of course, he's the father of two very, very young children with his wife, Carrie, and it may well be that it's the time for him to move more out of the public eye.
George, does Boris Johnson really have a political ideology, or does he just sort of throw populist spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks?
What a great question. And I think that this is the biggest problem that Boris Johnson has had, is that he is very free of ideology, really. He is somebody who does care about the environment. He's really, really quite passionate about net zero and the climate change problem. He does care about the City of London. When he was the London mayor, that mattered to him. But these are more sort of subject areas that matter to him. What he really cares about is being a leader, is being a winner, is being the top dog. He loves being loved and he hates not being loved. These are attributes which are not great for a prime minister, because it means it makes it hard to make the tough decisions. And if you are not driven by a guiding light of ideology, then it's kind of hard to deal with the management of the country, particularly in these extraordinarily turbulent times in which we live now, where decisions have to be made instantly and huge issues are happening all around us. Change is happening. Very hard if you are constantly being buffered around by the latest opinion poll or the latest person you don't want to upset. And I think perhaps that has been one of his biggest failings. He would say differently. He would say he is populist. He is responding to the electorate and giving people what they want. And of course, that's true up to a point. But of course, in the end, if you are not guided by a strong ideology, a strong mission with purpose, it's kind of hard these days to keep a strong, consistent line.
Well, we hear differently about Rishi Sunak, right? He's actually concerned about the fiscal picture, and that hasn't made him incredibly popular in these tough inflationary times. Is he the lead contender to replace Boris Johnson?
Well, a couple of things on that. Very, very good point. So firstly, is he the lead contender? He is one of the leading contenders. It's not quite clear yet whether he has a campaign. I think he does have a campaign, and he might team up with Sajid Javid, the health secretary, who resigned suspiciously within 5 minutes of Rishi a couple of nights ago. So that looks like there may be a dream team there. But he's not the front runner. He's not the front runner for a number of reasons. He's not massively known amongst parliamentarians, the Conservative members of Parliament, who are the first choosers here. Let's not forget that's the audience that matters. And here's this whole point about the fiscal position. You know, Nadhim Zahawi, who is the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, looked at what he was being asked to do over the last 12 hours, literally over last night, which was to cut taxes, to cut corporation taxes, to cut VAT, to cut personal taxes. And he realized that the global markets would see that as a crazy thing to do, and that would almost certainly result in the debt price of British debt being raised. And of course, that would have consequences for our repayments. And he felt that that was going to be very bad for Britain's economic standing. That is exactly the Rishi Sunak position as well, which is why Rishi Sunak refused to do what Boris Johnson wanted him to do. And that's why Rishi Sunak was had to resign, essentially.
Well, George, we can talk about Rishi Sunak or any of the other contenders and their likelihood to actually become prime minister in October. But before we even get to October, can Boris Johnson realistically stay on as caretaker over the next 3 months?
It's a really, really tough choice for the Conservative Party. Many of them don't want him to stay. Many of them want to hand in the seals of office today and to go by tonight. And Dominic Raab would be the caretaker over the summer period. They think that Boris Johnson, whilst maintaining power, will continue to perhaps do damage to either the country or the Conservative Party. Others, however, think that there is an important sequential moment here, and it's important to have the Prime Minister still in post to create some continuity and for ministers to carry on governing. So there is a bit of a clash right now in the Conservative Party about whether he should go or not. And it is possible, definitely, for him to stay over the summer months, but many in his party fear that that would be damaging to the party.
But hasn't all the damage to the party already been done? I mean, we focus on the man at the top, but isn't this a larger Tory problem?
Right, so this is the big problem they're about to have. They've already got a problem because of what are the events that have led to this incredible day. So the breakdown in competence, the breakdown in some people's behavior. And it looks like this is a party in shambles. But that's nothing as to what we're about to see as the Conservative Party goes through a 3-month leadership battle with many, many contestants, which will inevitably be seen as hostility towards each other, briefing against each other, negativity. And the message to the voter is these guys need to go away and sort out their differences and then come back when they've got their pain sorted and they've got a new leader. And that's going to be very damaging, I think, to the Conservative Party, which is why a number of very senior Conservatives are telling me today what they're trying to do is to urge 2 or maybe 3 of the top candidates to come together privately and agree amongst them that one of them, 2 of them maybe should go to the party and say it's going to be us and nobody else. That's a hard trick to pull off, but they're doing that because they can see the potential damage of a 3-month leadership contest.
George, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. George Pascoe-Watson, former political editor of The Sun, giving us his perspective on UK politics. I'm pleased to say I'm joined here in Westminster by Lord Robert Hayward, Tory Peer and Polling analyst. It's a real pleasure to have you here, Lord Hayward. Thank you very much for joining us. So we get ready for our 4th leader in 6 years. I feel like for a markets and economics presenter, I spend a lot of time in Westminster these days. Robert, what's your perspective? Let's look back briefly. What's your perspective as to what went wrong? Because there were a whole lot of things you could choose from.
Boris is a great personality. That's what actually appealed to a large section of the electorate. That's his strength, but it's also his weakness. And what has gone wrong is his inability to understand how very large sectors of the electorate feel about indiscretions.
About indiscretion. So this goes back to Partygate.
It goes before Partygate.
Yeah, to the other
it goes
scandals that
expenses and all those sorts of things. Owen Paterson's expenses issues. So yes, it's an attritional process, but it's overwhelmingly to do with personality rather than policy.
And breaking the law or getting close to it.
All those sorts of things. This is the first leadership election that I've seen, and of both parties over 30 odd years, that has been about personality. Most leadership elections are to do with policy.
How does the Tory party find somebody to fill those shoes? Because personality-wise, they are big shoes to fill, but I suppose we've all come a long way. We know a lot more than in 2019.
We do, but I don't think any organisation sets out to find the same person. And because they couldn't anyway.
So what's the antidote?
The alternative, I think there'll be quite a big field, because I think the view the Tory party will take is, well, there's 1.5 years, 2 years to the next general election, gives the opportunity for a new Prime Minister to get bedded in. I think it's likely to be a Brexiteer, but somebody who can bring the party together. Although, ironically enough, the events of the last 72 hours have probably meant that actually it's become pretty unified against Boris Johnson.
So that's one of the things in his legacy, I suppose, already.
Sadly, yes.
Some ability to unite the Conservative Party. Do you find your candidate yet? Robert, have you spotted an individual you're backing?
I spend my time doing the analysis and watching the moves of the different candidates. Some of those potential candidates have actually been preparing their leadership election for a while. It's the reality of politics. But they will all now come out into the open. Suella Braverman, much to my surprise, announced an interest in running yesterday.
Just resigned as Attorney General.
Absolutely, and I know Suella very well. I've chaired many of the selections for these people when they were chosen as candidates for their constituencies.
International financial audiences will be familiar with names like Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor, Sajid Javid, who was also Chancellor for a brief period, and then Health Minister. Are we likely to see those big internationally recognised names at the forefront, or is this a time for newcomers?
I think you're absolutely right. It will be a combination of both in terms of the field. Those that America and the viewers from the Middle East and the Far East will recognise, but equally names that are unheard of. But the markets get used to new names. They're faced by them all the time.
We'll have a different tone, whoever takes over. Too early to say, of course, what kind of direction policy will take. Can we say anything about which direction policy will not go in as a result of Prime Minister Boris Johnson's expected departure?
I think there are two issues here. One is the period from today when Boris says he's going to stand down, and the issue now for the Tory party is to say whether he is going to be allowed to continue as acting Prime Minister but not policy directing Prime Minister.
Do you think he will be able to be any kind of caretaker?
He wants to be, from what we're hearing.
Which is that surprising to you?
Not surprising about him, because that's Boris.
Right.
But I do know, my sense is that it's going to be difficult when you have many ministers resigning because they're saying, well, actually, you lack integrity and decency. It's very difficult to then say, well, I'll serve in a government with the same person still as Prime Minister. So that's a battle over the next 3 or 4 days, unless it's resolved today. Then you get to the next Prime Minister, probably a Brexiteer, but somebody who has a manner that can bring the party together, probably a less confrontational, more policy-driven.
And just briefly, does the process have to last till October? These things can be accelerated. It was, I remember, after David Cameron resigned.
It's very difficult because we're so close to the summer recess. And if, as I expect, we're going to have a lot of candidates, I think it's going to be virtually impossible to compress into 2 or 3 weeks.
OK, so we have months of this to look ahead to.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, Lord Robert Hayward. Thanks for spending time with us here. Tory Peer and pollster. Coming up on the programme, we'll get further perspectives on all of the evolving politics here in the UK. More on Boris Johnson's expected resignation. We'll speak to Ben Page, CEO of the polling company Ipsos Mori. The public doesn't get a say in this. This is down to first Conservative MPs and then members of the Conservative Party, but he will have a good take on what they think and what they would like to see from a new leader as well. This is Bloomberg. I'm Anna Edwards from Westminster with Matt Miller and Kailey Leinz in New York. A big morning for UK politics. We understand that Boris Johnson is going to call it quits after an unprecedented wave of resignations from his own government. Matt, I stopped counting at 50, but he got over 50, the number of cabinet ministers, other ministers and their aides who resigned from the government payroll, an expression of dissatisfaction with Prime Minister Boris Johnson's leadership. The game is then up, the fight is up, and he looks set to resign. We just wait for that podium to be wheeled out into Downing Street. We've seen it a number of times before over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'll be interesting to see if he can stay on as caretaker, PM, if he'll even be able to build a government with the few backbenchers that he has left, and of course, who will follow him as leader of the Tory party, Anna. So there's still a lot we have left to find out.
Yeah, absolutely. Kailey, we've got markets, of course, in their stride, focused on entirely different things. We did see a little bit of reaction to this, actually, on in terms of the pound market reaction. But elsewhere, I suppose, the focus is, in other parts of the market, the focus is elsewhere. Post-Fed, we haven't even mentioned the Fed minutes yet.
No, we haven't, committing to that hawkish policy. But it really speaks to the moment we're in, Anna, that this comes at a terrible time for the UK economy. You have inflation running rampant, consumer confidence on a downtrend, serious growth concern out there. It leaves monetary policy in a really tough spot. And now there's serious question marks as to the trajectory of fiscal policy given this shakeup at the very top of the UK government.
Yeah, and yet global assets, despite the political distractions here in the UK and the threat of tighter monetary policy, risk assets have been finding it within themselves to go higher, certainly in the early part of the European trading day, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't seem like markets have reacted to this at all. We saw the pound at 119 before. It's still at 119. We saw the FTSE up 1.25%. It's still up that. S&P futures currently up about 0.25% right now. So a little bit of optimism in terms of risk assets. And you do see investors willing to let go of the 10-year debt right now, pushing the yield higher. So a march back to 3%. Remember the question we've been asking about U.S. yields is, did we peak at 3.5? Or are we headed back there right now? NYMEX crude has come back down under $100, but it's headed up again. Right now only 64 cents to 99. 919. But for Texas Intermediate, that's probably welcome respite to the Biden administration and U.S. consumers. And then Bitcoin right now moving only 0.4% and still holding at that $20,000 level. It's really been interesting to watch it get stuck at these big $10,000 round levels from 40 to 30 and now 20. Kailey, what do you see in terms of pre-market movers?
Yeah, we love those round numbers, Matt. There is actually a lot going on beneath the surface of the equity market, even though we're so focused on the macro picture and the politics picture today. One of the big stock stories is GameStop. It announced after the bell yesterday a 4-for-1 stock split. Now, we know that doesn't change anything fundamentally about the company, and yet it always seems after these announcements the stocks rise. The idea being it makes it more accessible to retail traders who will then come in and buy. And you are seeing buying for that stock this morning. It's up about 10% before the bell. Another stock moving higher is CGen. This is after a Wall Street Journal report that Merck is in advanced talks to buy the company for $200 a share. That stock trading at 180 this morning, up about 3 percentage points. And finally, overnight in Asia, we got positive results out of Samsung, the South Korean giant. Better revenue growth than expected eases some concern around demand in the chip space. And as a result, a lot of chip stocks moving higher in the U.S. pre-market session. Applied Materials up 2%, AMD up about 1.4%, Anna.
Yeah, and important to pick up on that thought as we look at European assets as well then, Kailey. Let's check out where we are on the European story. And the day started really positively, actually, despite, as I say, all the political distractions. And we did actually see the pound getting a lift higher as we got that news that Prime Minister Boris Johnson intends to resign. Some of that has been unwound now, but we see European stocks have moved a little bit higher today. And we focus on the pound, of course, because of the politics. Mining stocks have been doing quite nicely. That's on the back of a bit of a rebound that we saw in some of those mining names, some of those mining underlying commodities, I should say. But that was a bit of an unwind of a previous day's move. And ST Micro, coming back to Kailey's point about what's going on at Samsung, ST Micro, one of the European chip names, moving higher on that story. Let's get back to the UK politics. Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden is in Downing Street, and she is fighting for position with the rest of the global media and looking out for the arrival of that podium that signals that the Prime Minister is going to make a statement, at least I assume is going to happen in Downing Street. I mean, we saw Prime Minister Cameron make a speech from there. We saw Theresa May make her very emotional speech from just where you are, Lizzie.
Yes, Anna, soon we'll be touching elbows. First the cars came, then the cameras, and still there's no podium, but the crowds are gathered beyond the gate, beyond the security at the end of Downing Street. Finally, we're at the moment where Boris Johnson is expected to hand in his resignation today. It came after a wave of resignations, unprecedented in recent British political history, paralysed the government, and it had seemed increasingly inevitable. Of course, you've had the Pestminster sex scandal, the Partygate scandal and the cost of living crisis, all building too much pressure for these MPs, ministers to bear. And Johnson says that we're hearing plans to resign but stay on as a caretaker leader, but even that is now facing opposition. We're hearing pushback from MPs, one saying that he's poison, that it should move over to Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister. But in any case, it's a humiliating end to a political career as someone who won a landslide majority only 3 years ago, the biggest since Margaret Thatcher.
Well, and Lizzie, you speak of all of the resignations that led up to this, and those are continuing. The Environment Minister, Rebecca Powell, just issuing her letter of resignation. Who's going to be left to hold things together between now and October?
It'll be interesting to divide the leadership candidates between those who remained loyal and those who quit on Boris Johnson. The next stage is this leadership contest. It splits into 2 stages. First of all is the shortlisting section. MPs put forward their own names. It'll be a huge pool of candidates, but it's whittled down to 2 names, and the idea is to keep out extreme ones. The second stage then goes to the grassroots members of the Conservative Party and whittling it down to the 1 name. But the timescales for each are set out by the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers. If it takes until October to find a new Prime Minister, it only gives the next Premier 14 months to set a new agenda before the next general election.
14 months seems like an eternity, Lizzie, so that should be enough. Lizzie Burden reporting from Downing Street. Joining us now is Ben Page, CEO of polling company Ipsos. Ben, I wonder what you think is the straw that broke the camel's back. Was it really this Pincher scandal? Was it Partygate? Or is it actually an economic story? Is it actually that the Conservatives are and that the electorate is tired of dealing with this cost of living issue?
Well, it's all of the above. Interestingly, the Conservatives actually have a narrow lead still on being the best party to manage the economy. And so I think it's more the endless scandals. Most British people don't think Boris Johnson tells the truth. And to be honest, we never elect the leader who is seen as most honest. But the Conservative Party under his leadership has fallen to pretty much its lowest ever score in Ipsos's long-running series in terms of being fit to govern. We have only 21% of people who believe that they're fit to govern. It's collapsed over the last 12 months or so. And it's that I think is finally it's the straw that broke the camel's back with his own party. So we'll see, but it's not the economy per se. It certainly doesn't help. And I do think that this leadership battle that's to come is going to be fundamental in how Britain decides to deal with inflation and, of course, then what might happen on interest rates. Because you could see a populist leader from one of the runners and riders coming in and cutting taxes, which is likely to make our inflation problem last even longer.
Okay, yes, this certainly does seem to have become very personal and very much about Boris Johnson and his leadership, his style and his abilities. You suggest that we could see a populist coming in and cutting taxes. What are you thinking there of Nadhim Zahawi? I mean, do we have any names yet when you mention that, Ben?
All I would say is that most polling, when you ask about possible leaders for a political party, is almost worthless because it's usually, or very often, the one that people haven't heard of. And I suppose Nadhim Zahawi might be one of those people. He's not that well known in the country, well known inside the Conservative Party. But it's often a surprise. You may remember back in 2005, David Cameron was relatively little known and beat the much better known David Davis. Tony Blair, in the run-up after the death of John Smith, was again relatively little known in the country. John Major was not the favourite at the time Mrs. Thatcher had her problems in 1990. So it may well turn out to be someone that we haven't really heard that much from.
Well, Ben, you talked a little about the UK voter, just kind of the general feeling of the UK populace right now as it deals with this cost of living crisis, with inflation. Does domestic political turmoil like this just exacerbate those consumer confidence issues? I'm wondering if there is a broader economic ramification here.
Consumer confidence in the UK is currently at pretty much a historic low. It's back in the 2008 or 1980s level. We've been tracking it every month since 1978. So it is at a pretty low level. But that is more about the economy and what people are feeling in their pay packets.
Right, but does political uncertainty make that worse, I guess is the question.
To a certain extent, but I think that's more for the pundits and for the media. The public are looking at how much do I get each month and how much can I buy? And that really, rather than the politicians per se, is the issue. At the same time, it's true to say that the proportion of people in Britain who spontaneously, without any prompting, tell us the biggest problem facing the country is not the economy, it's just the politicians themselves, is at an unprecedented 1 in 4 people. So almost as many people are saying it's the politicians are a problem. But in terms of how people feel about the economy, it is the real world and what they can actually buy with their money.
Okay. Ben, back to the process of choosing the new leader. I spoke to Lord Hayward just a moment ago, and he was saying this could be a long process, partly because so many candidates will put their names forward. After the Brexit vote, there was a sense that the country needed to move on quickly and get a leader quickly, and so one was found very quickly. Do you not think, then, that this will be in any way a condensed process, and we could have to wait months to get a new leader?
No, I mean, the way the Conservative Party rules, unless they change the rules, as they were about to before he said he was going to resign, because the rules mean that if somebody doesn't come through clearly in the first round, they will go off to this vote in the country with the membership. And so the challenge is that the Conservative Party remains very divided, and this is one of their problems. Boris is a catalyst for this, but actually there isn't a clear successor that unites the left wing of the party or the One Nation Conservatives, the right wing, the hard Brexiteer element of the party. And so I think it's quite likely that we will have turmoil for some period to come until they finally settle on one individual who will have a massive task in uniting the party and then ultimately the country.
Ben, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your insight today. Ben Page there, who is the CEO of Ipsos. Now, coming up, lender, borrower, and investor Sam Bankman-Fried is all things to the bankrupt crypto broker Voyager, and we learned that his company, Alameda, had actually taken a huge loan from the exchange. More on that next. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. You're looking live at the principal room. Coming up later today, Volkswagen CEO Herbert Diess. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Kailey Leinz with Matt Miller in New York and Anna Edwards from Westminster. Well, we've talked a lot about UK politics today, but we want to venture over to the crypto universe because Voyager's bankruptcy filing provides a bit of a roadmap into the company's relationships, including borrowers, lenders, and investors. And it turns out Alameda Research, the trading firm co-founded by crypto billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried, is all three. Emily Nicole, Bloomberg crypto reporter, joins us now. So, Emily, we already knew that he lent Voyager money. It turns out he actually also owes them money, and he's invested. It's the whole trifecta. Explain.
Yeah, so it's day 2 since Voyager filed for bankruptcy, and the filings that are coming out of that are showing us quite a map between Alameda and Voyager. Alameda lent Voyager around $485 million in a mix of crypto and US dollars a few weeks ago because of the chaos that's happening in crypto markets at the moment. And now that Voyager's filed for bankruptcy, we learned that not only is Alameda still owed $75 million of that, but it also has a $377 million loan to Alameda from Voyager. So it is both borrowing and investing. And on top of that, it has a more than 9% stake in the business. So there's a lot of different risks at play here.
This is, to me, the most puzzling part, Emily Nicole. Why on earth would Alameda have borrowed money, now more than it's owed, from Voyager?
Well, I can't pretend to know the thinking of Sam Bankman-Fried on that one, but it is something that is inherent in the crypto industry. It's becoming incredibly apparent that a lot of intermixing goes on between different players, and it's something that's really causing a bit of a headache right now. It's why so many crypto lenders are struggling, because there is so much contagion across different assets, different players. So many companies are exposed to the fallout of 3 Arrows Capital, a hedge fund that is in the process of going bust at the moment. And whether or not crypto will ever be able to recover from this interweaving web is a matter for the future to decide.
Emily, thanks so much for joining us. Emily and Nicole there, Bloomberg crypto reporter, talking to us about Voyager and Sam Bankman-Fried. Be sure to catch Bloomberg Crypto every Tuesday at 1 p.m. New York time, 6 p.m. in London. This is Bloomberg.
The last thing this country needs, frankly, is an election. The earliest date that I can see for a general election is in 2 years from now.
That was UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson testifying to the Liaison Committee just yesterday. A lot's happened since then. We were talking then about whether he might be tempted to call an early election. It looks like he is going to resign. We wait for him to do so, but that is the understanding now. Let's get to the economic implications of all of this. Anna Stipczynska joins us, Fidelity International's global macro economist. Anna, good to have you with us. Thanks for coming to talk to us on Bloomberg. So from an economic perspective, we know a lot of the challenges facing the UK economy, and a lot of them, frankly, are international. They may be made worse by local, national, post-Brexit dynamics here in the UK. But do we expect any big changes in policy or any big revised ability to stand in the way of those international forces from a new leader?
It's hard to say because, as you say, a lot of the shocks that the economy is facing now is already in the pipeline. These are the shocks that are coming from the outside. And I think when thinking from a macro perspective, we would of course focus on the potential changes to fiscal policy and what this means for the BOE. But for the time being, as we won't have probably information on fiscal policy for now, at least for the next few weeks, I think the BOE is on its own, and they have to do what an independent inflation targeting central bank has to do, and that is to get control of inflation. So if anything, I think the interest rate path, the promised path, remains intact.
Some people have been suggesting if we did see a chancellor and a new leader who wanted to cut taxes, then that frees, in a sense, the Bank of England to do more hiking. Does that make sense, Anna, for fiscal and monetary policy to work in opposite directions in that way?
Well, again, if the BOE needs to control inflation expectations and inflation, they will have to lean against the fiscal policy. This is happening, obviously, at the time where growth signals are flashing red, and the UK is very likely to go into recession. Whether it's a short technical recession or a longer one is unclear, and potentially the fiscal policy would be looking to cushion this. But I think these are the forces that mean that the interest rate will likely to go high given the inflation backdrop.
What about the rest of Europe, Anna? I mean, is a recession likely this year?
Yes, we have actually been looking at indicators, particularly focusing on expectations for the next month and next quarter that we get from the surveys. And they are all dropping very sharply, not just in Europe, but in the US as well. And that reinforces our view of a hard landing. And actually, we think that the recession is imminent. It's more imminent than is generally believed in the markets. It is imminent in Europe, and it is imminent in the US.
In that case, are the ECB's hands tied to an extent? I mean, we see the euro right now just cresting $1.02. It fell obviously below that yesterday, and many people are calling for parity. Is that inevitable?
I think the ECB or generally central banks are still focusing on inflation and the implications for inflation expectations. Growth concerns are entering their thinking, but they have told us both the ECB and the Fed in particular, that they will be following data and they will not be proactive. They will be reactive to the data. They follow labor markets, the unemployment rate, they follow inflation, which are quite lagging indicators. So it seems to me that for the time being, the focus will remain on inflation for the next couple of meetings or so, while growth damage is already being done.
Anna, we might have lagging indicators, but we have very live spot prices on commodity markets. And in terms of those gas prices, they could jump, you know, who knows how high if we don't see Russia turn back on the taps after expected maintenance work later on this month. I know that's a sort of niche point, but it has big implications. How weak does the European economy get if that is the case, just briefly?
I don't think it's a niche point. I think this is a systemic shock, which takes time to unravel. And of course, Europe is more vulnerable, but actually the rest of the world is also vulnerable to the shocks from the war in Ukraine. And our base case is that the gas flows will remain at these low levels. They will not go up. And that means rationing potentially going into winter, as inventories will not be built up to the level that's necessary. And that could mean quite deep recession in Europe.
Okay, Anna, thanks so much for joining us. Anna Stupnicka of Fidelity International giving us her thoughts on the UK economy and the European economy beyond. That is it for Early Edition. A special edition of Surveillance is coming up. They come to you live from Washington. I and the rest of the team will be here in London as well. This is Bloomberg.